Okojie, and I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation at South Bank Centre in partnership with English Pen with our esteemed guest, Tsitsi Dangarembga. Please give her a round of applause again. She joins us to talk about her incredible new essay collection, Black and Female, as well as her inspiring career. There'll be 5 minutes at the end for audience questions later, so please do have them to hand. In the meantime, I'd like to properly introduce Tsitsi without further ado. Tsitsi Dangarembga is the author of 3 novels: Nervous Conditions, winner of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, This Smallable Body, shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and the Book of Knots. She won the Pen Pinter Prize in 2021 and the Peace Prize of the German Book Trade. She is also a filmmaker, playwright, and the director of the Institute of Creative Arts for Progress in Africa Trust, a recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Prize 2022. She lives in Harare, Zimbabwe. She's currently in court proceedings before the state there, so we're very, very lucky to have her. Thank you, Tsitsi.
Thank you, Irenosen.
Firstly, congratulations on this incredible galvanizing ode to Black female artistic creativity, traversing everything from your experience being fostered by white parents in Dover as a kid, to finding your voice as a Black female writer, but also producing these disruptive works, really, that I think push back against the state and the patriarchy and our feminist leaning. I mean, there's so much there. Could you talk a little bit about laying the groundwork to get to this point, to write a book like this, and also why it felt like the right time for this book to be out?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm really glad that we're here to have this conversation today. I'm looking around because there's a particular face that I'm hoping to see in the audience, and that's my sister. And maybe she hasn't arrived yet. But that's why I just wanted to explain. Oh my God! You know, I've been looking like behind the fan. sorry, but that was really special for me because I don't come to London, to the UK so often. So I'm really excited to have my sister here, who has been a quiet bastion of support in my life, and it's just wonderful that I get to share this moment with you, Rudo. Yes, about these essays. Well, I was telling Irenosen that I never thought that I would write non-fiction, because I prefer the control I have when I'm writing fiction. If things seem not to be going the way I want them to go when I'm writing fiction, I simply change it and ask them to go the way I want them to, and because I'm doing the asking and the writing, they usually comply. And I live in Zimbabwe. I've been living in Zimbabwe since 2020. I have had experiences of living outside Zimbabwe. As Irenosen mentioned, I was fostered in the UK when I was young. And since after that, I did come back for a brief period to study in the UK. And I've also lived in Germany for a while. And those were experiences of being highly melanated, as I like to describe myself, in populations that were lesser melanated. And I cannot say that those experiences were particularly wonderful. And so it was important for me to go back to Zimbabwe and to be part of whatever processes were going on in Zimbabwe. So I've been there for 2 and a bit decades now without leaving. And I have seen things become progressively worse, the crisis in the country. And I really didn't think that I would want to write about the issues that have made it so difficult for me to feel at home in any place at all in the world, whether this was the UK, whether it was Germany, whether it's Zimbabwe. But what happened is that because of the fiction, I received quite a number of offers to deliver public talks on different topics. And I really wanted to make sure that I would say exactly what I wanted to say. So I developed the habit of writing out every word verbatim and practicing really like 5 or 10 times in front of the mirror. People say you're meant to practice in front of your cat, but my cat would not even sit still long enough. And I would deliver these speeches as a performance. So I was sure that I had the content that I wanted to deliver. So when my agent asked me whether I write non-fiction, I didn't want to actually say no. So I said, well, I have these speeches. And that's when she said, well, can't you use those speeches to write some non-fiction on those topics? My inclination was to say, no, I can't. But I didn't think that was a good thing to say to an agent who probably knows better than I do what's good for me. And so I said I would try. And I was sure that I would fail, and after she'd read a little bit, maybe the first essay, she'd say, okay, Tsitsi, we don't have to do this. But she said I should go on and write the 3 that we had planned. And so that is how Black and Female came to be.
That's, I mean, this is an example of how humble you are as a writer. We were talking earlier and I was saying it's the combination of having such a powerful voice, but also that humility that you come to the page with that makes you such an impressive writer. I feel that curiosity about not only processing your experience as a Black woman writer moving through the world, but the experiences of others. And this book, it's such a bold work. Even the title alone, I find so charged, Black and Female, and it's incredibly unapologetic and kind of badass all at once. But the book explores intersections of race, femininity, sexuality. What I love about it is that so much of our lives as Black women artists remain hidden. And I think what this book does, by you writing about your specific experiences, is it kind of lifts the lid off that in a way. You know, you talk about the complexities that Black women have to carry, moving through the world as artists, but also the beauty of that. And interestingly enough, you talk about that label not being limiting, this really resonated with me, not being limiting in terms of your imagination and your sense of freedom. You have absolute freedom when you come to the page. It's how other people pigeonhole you within the world that becomes interesting to watch. But there is such power about the way you write about this, in the sense that it's regenerative. It didn't feel depressing, it felt powerful, it felt galvanizing. Was that your intention in terms of, framing the work?
I try to be helpful in my writing. I do approach it from experience, my experience and the experience of other people, because I think it is by sharing our experiences in ways that can touch other people emotionally that we learn more of who we are in relation to each other and also in relation to ourselves. And I think that's really one of the important things that we need to do more of going forward as we face the various crises in the world that we face today. And I think for me, I perceive it as a privilege to have that capacity to distill the essence of experience. I don't even know how I do it. It's just something that happens. when I say, okay, I would like to write about this because I have seen something that has moved me, that has touched me, and then it's a kind of inner exploration that also projects outwards to find the things that correspond to this inner search that I have begun. And I'm actually grateful when the material comes to me, and it's kind of like it allows me to put it on the page. That's how I always think about it.
It's interesting that you say that. Do you think your years of practice allow you to trust that when you get into that space, that the writing's going to come? Because it's slightly different when you're used to writing fiction, I think. Because non-fiction is a different animal in a way. So is it drawing from that same practice that you've done this before, albeit it's something different, so you will be able to, create the writing. And there are things that you want to say, things that you experience that you want to comment on. So I wondered if it felt like incredibly liberating in a way to actually say, oh, finally I can talk about some of this stuff.
I had delivered the speeches, so I had been through that. But in terms of whether it's liberating to have written before, in fact, I find it intimidating. And I am also concerned about making the whole process cognitive rather than affective and emotional. And I think that the more I write, the more difficulty I have in switching off that cognitive voice and just letting the emotional flow predominate and determine which words will come. So I find it a challenge, in fact. I mean, I know that, yes, I can find the words, but I do not believe that I will be able to find the words that correspond to what I actually want to say. And there's nothing more awful than having written a whole draft and then going back to read it and thinking, oh my goodness, what was I talking about? This isn't at all what I had to say. And knowing I have got to start again and switch off whatever it was that caused me to write this draft that didn't work at all.
That's really interesting. It's your first non-fiction book, as we've said, and all your work is really groundbreaking. Actually, I was thinking, reading this book, this is really groundbreaking and landmark. But you can say that for every book you've written, in the sense that they've all, I think, challenged the status quo and the expectations people have around black female voices, the subject matters that we're expected to explore. And you seem to just take that on really, really boldly without any fear. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about cultivating that voice. In the book you mention drawing your confidence from feminism and intersectionality within feminism as a kind of jump-off point. But I wondered if you could elaborate a bit more, how that came about, what gave you that confidence to know these are the kind of things I want to explore, and I want to be really clear about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, there are two aspects to that. There's the content aspect and there's the voice aspect. How did I manage to give voice to the content that was important to me? And so the content aspect was that as a child, I simply did not read books about people like me. Having had part of my childhood in the UK, I read Enid Blyton, for example, and I've been traumatized by the Gollywog. I can remember looking at the depictions of this Gollywog and having some kind of sense that there was some relationship, but it was a wrong relationship to me. And that was something I carried with me, excuse me, for a long time indeed. And so I read all of that kind of thing. Then we went back to Zimbabwe and it wasn't any different. My father would go to town and he would come back and he would have, what was it, the Swiss chalet stories about the girls in the boarding school in Switzerland and that kind of thing, Heidi whatever. Narnia Chronicles, all excellent children's literature, but I wasn't in it. You know, so I was always reading over a chasm, as it were, and thinking, what is this gap that means that I cannot be represented in literature? Until I started reading books that were on my parents' shelves. And one of them was a book by Kamare Naye from Guinea. And at that time it was called The African Child. They've changed the title now. And it was about a boy and his sister. And I was just so fascinated by the sister. And her name was Fanta, which I didn't know it was Fanta at the time. I thought it was Fanta, which was really funny for me, a young girl in Zimbabwe, thinking, oh, why would anyone call their daughter the name of an orange drink? You know, but it was the first time that I saw a girl like me doing things like me, walking in dusty environments, hot, dusty environments, having to get water, having a brother who was an African brother. And I realized that that chasm could be filled, and I think that was the moment when something happened to me and I thought, it doesn't have to be like that. I can be represented in literature. So that was something I really wanted to do. Now the question was how to do it. I didn't know how to do it because I grew up in a fairly conservative environment where men had more voice than women. My brothers had more voice than I had. And so I didn't know how to come to that voice that I wanted to. Being in Cambridge didn't help because it was wonderful and I made wonderful friends there, met really wonderful people. But this was the time that Zimbabwe's liberation struggle was raging on and then coming to an end, as it did in 1979 with the Lancaster House Conference. And it was as if none of this was happening in Cambridge. Nobody was interested in the fact that a former colony was going through this process. And I was utterly shocked because I thought, this is part of empire, although not in those terms, but this is part of empire that determined who I am and how I grew up. And no one seems to have any idea of it amongst the people that I associated with as an undergraduate at Cambridge. And it seemed to me that this was not a place that would be useful for me in engaging with those kinds of issues. And so I went back to Harare. And I returned to university in 1982, which was just 2 years after independence, and before the state had commandeered everything. And there was a very vibrant women's movement at the time, and there were real efforts to have engagements across class and across race, across age even, all kinds of different demographic divisions. And that's where I really learned my feminism and the techniques that we had at that time of support and flat structures and this kind of thing. And that's where I started my reading and began to understand the structural issues pertaining to gender and how gender functions in the world. And I thought, well, okay, I have all this. I'm one of the lucky ones. I came from an environment where I might not have been so fortunate, where I know that there are so many other young Zimbabwean girls who have not been fortunate to have the experience that I have. So let me write something for them that can open up their minds to the fact that yes, you have agency, you're allowed to have agency, you have a voice, you're allowed to have a voice, you have desires, there are things you want for yourself in life, you're allowed to have these desires and you're allowed to go out and fight for them. So that's how I came, that's how my content came to voice. And that's why feminism was so important for me at that time.
Thank Thank you for articulating that so beautifully. That's amazing. It's about them being seen, and like you say, having that agency, being given permission in a way through your fiction to have that agency. I want to pivot back to your childhood in Dover, because I think that's really interesting. You talk about blackness, the experience of blackness there as people pertaining it to skin colour, whereas later on you saw it more as a political identity. But I really connected with that because I was thinking back to when I first moved to the UK, going to boarding school in Norfolk, and I wasn't aware that I was black until I was in the middle of nowhere in Norfolk attending this boarding school, and suddenly people would make reference to it. And you talk in the book actually about somebody making a disparaging remark, calling you a lovely little pickaninny, and because it was said so nicely, you thought it was a compliment, but then your mother was like, that is a really disparaging comment. So Zimbabwe obviously is a huge influence on your writing, and your choice to live there is between there and Germany is really interesting to me as an African writer. I was talking to Igoni Barrett, a Nigerian writer. Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
Who wrote Black Ass a couple of years back, and he was saying that he chooses to live in Nigeria because there is a story about Nigeria that's still waiting to come to him, and he kind of needs to be there for that story to come. I mean, you've written so incredibly about Zimbabwe. I wondered if you could just speak to that. Are there things you still want to explore happening there? Things that you still feel actually this needs to be interrogated and explored on the page?
Okay, I think my writing is often not so intentional, but I'll go back to your point about blackness and how one comes to understand that one is said to be black. Being fostered in Dover was an interesting experience. Of course, I was a black child along with my brother in this foster family, but we were not referred to as black. If there was any reference to colour, it was coloured, which was the word that was used at the time. But my foster family generally spoke with respect to nationality. So you would hear, oh yes, the child who was here before, he was Nigerian, somebody else was Ghanaian. And so it was not clear to me that this physical difference was a marker of importance at the time. And I do not even remember being aware of the physical distance while I was with my foster family until I went to school. And I had my first boyfriend, who was a little white boy in my class. And one day he said to me, Tsitsi, why is your skin that color? Maybe if I hold your hand long enough, it will change. And I can remember that was the first time I looked at my hand and thought about its color. And I thought about the idea that had been planted in my mind that this color might need to change. And I had never thought about that before, and I think children went to school at the age of 4 at that time, so I must have been about 4. But even then, that was not the notion of blackness. He did not use the word black, so probably that word was not used in his environment either. I think it would have been in Rhodesia, when we went back, that I understood that I was black, and to be black was undesirable, and it meant a whole lot of things that made you a lesser kind of human being, in fact almost not even human. And so it was a category that I think, because of the experience that I had had with my foster family, and also because of the story that's in the book, where my mother told me that people use disparaging words for people of our skin color and call that skin color black, that I decided I was not going to identify with that category. And so, for purposes of discourse, for purposes of talking, for purposes of practice, I use the word, but as you said, I use it in a political sense, not in a sense that I identify with it personally. I identify with the whole construct that has been built up around it, but I would be equally happy with any other construct, and that's why I prefer to call myself highly melanated.
also a very good term. I think it would be the perfect opportunity to hear a reading from you.
Okay. I am struggling a little bit with my voice, so it's going to be a very short reading. It's from the very beginning, and I hope it will inspire you to want to read more, for those who haven't read the essays already. Yes, it's called Writing While Black and Female. So you may be asking yourselves why I have an essay called Writing While Black and Female when I'm saying I don't identify black. It actually wasn't my title. It was my wonderful editor's title, and when I heard the title, I kept quiet because I thought, well, my editor knows better than I do what the market requires at this moment in time, so I'll leave that to her and I will just supply the content. So that's why there's that little contradiction there. The first wound for all of us who are classified as black in inverted commas is empire. This is a truth many of us, whether we are included in that category or not, prefer to avoid. Today, the wounding empire is that of the Western nations. The empire that covered more than 80% of the globe at its zenith in the 19th century. It includes the British Empire that colonized my country, Zimbabwe, in the 1890s. I was born into empire. My parents were products of empire, as were their parents before them, and their parents before that, my great-grandparents. A major early objective of empire was what it called trade, also in inverted commas. Trade is premised on desire. Desire without love dwindles into lust, and empires, being impersonal, cannot love. Lust, impersonal desire that demands satisfaction, is dangerous at every level. The personal, the social, the global. Imperial lust has wounded every part of the world that empire touched, and today we know it has wounded the very planet that is our home. Thus has empire mutilated not only those it sought to subjugate, but also itself. This is the second wound that affects us all. We are yet to learn how to heal from the effects of an institution that stretches back into the time before we were born, but whose systems still work to disempower, dispirit, and dismember. How this can be done is a question very few dare to ask, because quite apart from not knowing the answer, it often seems there is none. Toni Morrison described certain horrors experienced by some of humankind as unspeakable. But today, those subjugated by empire speak. This speaking exposes imperial systems and strategies whose purpose has long been to hide the effects of race in the world. While black people lead in that area of scholarship and activism, others, including white men, though they may kick and scream, are prodded to discuss the world's racialization. Those who, like me, were wounded by the hubris of whiteness no longer say, "I hurt," and self-medicate in self-destructive ways, or act out a ruinous, enraged, and bitter pain on our communities, as that hubris demanded. Today we say, "You hurt me." Words that point not to the abjection and death that follow relentless self-mutilation, but to the possibility of removing oneself from the one who hurts, and thereafter transforming oneself into someone the one who hurts can no longer dismember. Look, we who are black or brown are frequently admonished, now that that which was unspeakable is finally being spoken. Look, why do you speak of damage? Here are the roads, the hospitals. You can read and write. You have medicines. How can you speak of damage? Even before any black or brown person was assimilated into the academic systems of imperial education, and before spaces had evolved in empire where these questions could be asked, we had an answer. We said, "We feel it." Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a powerful excerpt. We were talking earlier in the green room about the process of writing this book, and I wanted to ask whether you found it quite painful at times, because these are difficult subject matters, and it's such a vulnerable process, I think, to write a non-fiction book. It's not like fiction where there is that distance. I wonder if you could talk about that a little, about the process.
Yes, definitely it was not an easy book to write. What saved me, I think, is that I had all this material that I had written for public speaking, and that public speaking had often been in South Africa, where a lot of my fiction had been appreciated. So I was often asked to speak to people who really understood what I was talking about and were on the same page, and that was very empowering. But on the other hand, I realized early on, and I think that this was because of my experience of being a girl in a very patriarchal environment and having a brother who was older than me, so that I was a younger sister in this patriarchal environment, that words from people who are seen to be in a position of lesser power are not often welcome. And so I was aware that whenever I spoke up, I would have to defend myself. I was aware that there would be people who simply wanted to tell me that I didn't know what I was talking about. That still happens a lot on social media. So I felt that I had to write from the experiential perspective so that I would have the courage of my convictions to stand up and say, yes, I do know what I am talking about. And this is what makes that kind of writing so painful for me, because I find that I cannot write the things that I want to stand up and defend and vouch for unless I have experienced them in the process of writing. And that's why it's such a short book.
Yeah, essentially reliving some of those experiences again, I imagine, writing about them. Nervous Conditions struggled to get published in Zimbabwe. I think it was published by the Women's Press in the UK. And sat there for about 4 or 5 years before it was published. You actually visited the publishing house, to kind of say what happened and did you receive it before somebody dug it out of the basement. But I'm really interested in your experience of finding that voice, both as a novelist and a filmmaker. And in the book, you talk about the mediocre black narrative, which I'm so glad you touched on this because it's really interesting to me and it's something that I've picked up on. And you talk about being encouraged as a filmmaker by some white people in positions of power to deliver the mediocre black narrative. Now, this is interesting to me because I think we see it in publishing and other mediums where that is encouraged. And there are reasons for why that's encouraged. To me, it's a kind of sly subterfuge going on. So that it's just really, really fascinating. That not that there shouldn't be space for black mediocrity, because I think there should be, but what's fascinating to me is that it's often elevated over voices, genuinely incredible marginalized voices who often don't have the platform or they take much longer to become successful. And I really love that you touch on this in the book. So could you, especially now that we're in a landscape that seemingly seems more welcoming to black writers and persons of colour writers, but what is being celebrated and what isn't, what's being ignored and what's being elevated. So could you, it's fascinating, so could you talk about that?
Okay, yes. I talk about the celebration of mediocrity with respect to race and also with respect to gender. And I also talk about how, as a young writer in Zimbabwe, the male writers really did not want to give me any space at all. And we had a Zimbabwe Writers Union that functioned at the time, and they had, I think it was monthly meetings, and we would go and people would read and get feedback. And a lot of women would go along as well, and they would read, especially poetry, that I felt very disturbed, shall I say, to hear, because it really was not poetry that was conveying a great deal. And the men seemed to love this. and it was like keeping the women in their place, where they can only have a certain level of experience. You're not expected to even have the emotional capacity to experience things deeply or in a complex way. And I was actually quite disturbed about this, because I thought, well, how are these women going to improve if they come to these spaces and are told that they are producing wonderful work, when clearly the ideas are there, but it needs a lot more input before it can be wonderful. And these were the writers who were themselves published at the time. And so I can imagine a scenario now where they were not particularly concerned with encouraging people to be as good as they were or better. And so I think that really is part of the situation that we're facing with black mediocrity being celebrated and elevated. And I agree with you entirely. There should be space for that. But then what do we mean by mediocrity? Do we mean the kinds of stories that are being told, or do we really simply mean a lack of skill? So I think those are two aspects of mediocrity that are important. And I experienced that very much in my life as a filmmaker, where quite considerable sums of money are required to make a film, and it seems that these considerable sums of money are thrown at people who make the kind of narrative that would be expected by a white audience, that is defined by the white gaze. I don't know how intentional that is, whether a person actually thinks, okay, if I tell this kind of story, it is likely to be accepted, or whether because we live in a society where we are often reflected back to ourselves through the white gaze, that is actually the story we have to tell. I am not sure, but I do know that those stories, especially in film, are the ones that tend to be celebrated. And in my discussions with filmmakers, generally European, because I studied film in Germany, they tell me it's a pure competition thing. They do not want the kind of story that could challenge them, that could even bring in new genres. You know, genre is so culturally specific that if new genres were to become successful, it would mean that the culture that is outside that genre would now have a great competition, because they would not be able to function so well in that genre. So again, I think there are imperial reasons for encouraging mediocrity.
It's so interesting. This is the kind of stuff that makes me rage. It's so interesting. I mean, in the book, you talk about, you know, as a filmmaker, you have all these ideas, and you've written scripts that haven't received funding, but so you've had to write for other productions and filmmakers in order to work in that area, which is really, really frustrating. But yeah, it's
and could I just say something about, is that all right?
Yes,
yeah,
please do.
You know, and the kinds of films that I have been able to make have generally, at least the feature films, the full-length feature films, have been what I call the development film. And the funding comes from development aid packages. And so they are all about the problems. In fact, there are no human protagonists. The protagonists are just ciphers for the problem. You know, HIV, of course, child marriages, inheritance rights. And so what actually changes through the film is the human rights perspective. At the beginning of the film, there are no inheritance rights, and at the end of the film, there are inheritance rights. So that is the protagonist. And so as a person who is having this presented to you, you see yourself as a lack, as the personification of a problem. And so I personally think that those films do a lot more harm than good.
Thank you for that really important point. So something positive to go to. You were shortlisted for the Booker for this Monoble Body, which is a great achievement, especially considering the body of work that you have produced. What did it feel like to have that acknowledgement? Because like I said earlier, you're somebody that's very humble, you just quietly write, but to have that milestone and to get to that point, how did that feel?
Well, that felt that I had some really wonderful people who had been rooting to me, because it was very difficult to get this Mournable Body published as well. I tell the story in there. And I was so frustrated with not being able to publish that I started putting excerpts of it on Facebook. I was still on Facebook in those days. And Ella Wakatama read some of them and inboxed me.
Oh, Ella's incredible.
I know, absolutely.
Incredible.
Yeah, and she said, Tsitsi, when you're ready with the manuscript, let me have it. I'll have a look at it and we'll see what to do. So when I was...
She took it on pro bono.
Yeah, pro bono. She did not ask me for a cent. She read it, she told me what she thought, and she said she was going to find the publisher. And she did exactly that. She found the publisher, which was Grey Wolf in the United States. And then, as I understand it, Grey Wolf then spoke to Faber, and my wonderful editor, Louisa Joyner, was interested in the book, and that's how Faber came to get the book. And I think that's why I ended up having the honor of being shortlisted for the Booker Prize, because I had all these wonderful people who believed in me and made sure that the book came to the world.
But I think it also has a little bit to do with your talent as well. Because you're an amazing writer, so to give you credit. I want to touch on something that is important to me, and I know many writers, which is I love to find out who my favourite writers read and read, because it's a kind of a permission and passing on the bastion. So I would love to know who inspires you, and who are some of the people that inspired you to write this book. Also things that might surprise people, actually. Inspirations that might surprise people would be quite useful, I think, to know.
Okay, well, I don't really have inspirations for particular books. I have people who inspire me in a general way, and when I'm generally inspired, I think, well, I want to do something, and then I decide what it is. So I've already mentioned one of them, that was Kamara Laye, who told me that little girls who are highly melanated can exist in literature. So that was foundational for me. Some of the other books on my parents' shelves, well, they had a lot of Shakespeare and stuff, but they also had Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who at the time still called himself James Ngugi. And the one that I remember reading that really shook me was A Grain of Wheat, which was about the Mau Mau and the fight for independence in Kenya. And I was very young when I read that, but I think that without being able to articulate it, I could see the parallels with Zimbabwe. And so I really credit Ngugi for being the first prompt to my consciousness of anti-imperial struggle and African nationalist struggle. So that was definitely something that was always going to be important for me. And then, of course, along came Toni Morrison, and I just devoured everything that I could. And she gave me permission to look at very unpleasant parts of myself in the bluest sky. Because when I was a child in Dover, I used to be given these dolls, and they had these blue eyes. And for some reason, I used to poke these eyes out. And this was a guilty secret I had carried with me for like 2 decades. So I read this book, and here is this girl doing exactly the same thing. And I thought, yes, it is something that people like me do. And that was a permission that you are able and allowed to talk about these things. And then, of course, all the African American and Afro-Caribbean writers who were writing at the time were my great influences. And really, that was my foundation. Yeah.
Yeah, Toni Morrison, I mean, we're so lucky to have her body of work. I mean, she's just inspired so many people. Alice Walker as well, you mentioned in the book.
And you know, Toni Morrison, in one of her essays, she said, I decided I was going to center myself, and the rest of the world happens around me. And I could sense that in her writing. Now, you know, maybe I have this huge ego, which is why I responded to that, but I did respond to it. And I thought, you know, that's how it's meant to be. And my thinking was that if I center myself, I am constructed through experience with other people. It means I am also centering those other people. That was my thinking about it, yeah.
That's wonderful, wonderful way of expressing that. Your activism is part of who you are, both on and off the page. So you founded a women's film festival, for example, which you worked on for several years. But it also, I think, feels connected to how you process trauma, how we process trauma on the page. In the book you say, writing back against empire is a site of potential healing. The best writing opens the lesion again and again and cleanses. Then later on, I write to raise mountains, hills, escarpments and rocky outcrop over the gouges in my history, my societies, and their attendant spirits. It's just so palpable, that statement, and powerful. This regenerative power, this ability to use your imagination to create these wonderful cartographies. Could you talk about that a little?
Yes, I quote Reni Eddo-Lodge a lot in that second essay, yes. And one of the things, the ideas that she narrated so powerfully for me was the idea that people of my kind of pigmentation were seen to be like semi-human, like human cattle. They were actually categorized as a commodity that was human cattle, that was beings created for toil and draft and burdensome work. And that was something that really struck me, and it made so clear the way that we were not meant to have feelings. Trauma was not meant to traumatize us. We were able to get over trauma, like in half an hour, and we'd be ready to do the next thing that had to be done. We were not expected to talk about our trauma, whether it was personal or whether it was relating it to the social constructs around us. And the society was structured to make sure that that didn't happen. The British Empire had these literature bureaus throughout the empire where people would write the kind of literature that would help to consolidate empire, about missionaries and about bad women who went to the city and ruined men in the city, or fights between wives at home. This was the kind of literature that was being sponsored. And it was all in my opinion, it was all to make sure that we did not engage effectively with what was actually traumatizing us. And I think this can also be seen in the ways in which our wars were prosecuted, because our liberation wars were often prosecuted in terribly violent ways, so that the violence came not only from the colonizers and their armies, but also from the liberation armies. It is almost as though we had internalized that we are allowed to enact this kind of trauma because we have felt it ourselves without being able to express it, without being able to process it. So we are now allowed to project it onto this other highly melanated body. And so I think that has done a great deal of damage. And then we're told, okay, you have independence now, it's all over. This is the narrative, for example, in South Africa, okay, apartheid is over, so what is your problem? The problem is that we've been traumatized for half a millennium, and that's going to take a long time to repair.
And also that, I guess both interpersonally and at a structural level, that when you trying to hold people accountable, that there are very real punishments that can occur. I want to open up the floor now for the audience. If people, I'm sure people have been ruminating, so if there are any questions, the lady at the front for Tsitsi. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was so powerful and wonderful to hear you read your work and speak. I wanted to ask, how has your book, Black and Female, been received in Zimbabwe?
Okay, Black and Female has only been published in the UK at the moment. It will be published in the USA in January and in Germany in March, and I think the offers are still coming in. There hasn't been a Zimbabwean offer yet. Zimbabwe tends to lag behind, and as an example of how we tend to lag behind, just yesterday I approved the rights for a Shona translation of Nervous Conditions and the Book of Not. So it's momentous. It's a long time, but it finally happens, and so one just has to be patient.
That's wonderful. Gentleman at the front.
Thanks, Tsitsi. I'm a huge fan of your fiction, and so it was really eye-opening to read this book because it's a very different voice. Your fiction tends to kind of leave us with questions. This kind of was a lot more opinionated, so it's really nice to see two different voices from the same person. I wanted to ask about your fiction and the character of Tambudzai and what it is about her that makes you keep going back to tell her story over 2 decades now.
Okay, several things. When I wanted to create the character that would speak to young Zimbabwean women, I thought to myself, most people still live in the rural areas. That was what? In the 1980s, I think it was about 80% of the population was rural. Now it's about 67%. And it was a kind of defiance because I thought, who would expect a little girl who is not even the eldest in her family, who comes from one of the poorest families in the village, who has absolutely nothing going for her, to be the protagonist of a story. And I thought to myself, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to give those people who are seen as not really existing at the same level of humanity as others, that very same level. So that was the challenge that I set out with. When I finished Nervous Conditions, I realized that the story was not over, and it was difficult for me to go on because that was the time that Zimbabwe was promising, maybe, to be the kind of state that we hoped it would be. And I didn't want to write a story that went into the war and all the racial issues. I thought that that wasn't the moment for that kind of story. And that's one reason why the Book of Not took so long. And in fact, I gave myself permission to write the Book of Not in about 2000 when the land reform happened. And it was clear that all those stories we had told ourselves about being one nation, etc., had been myths and had been made up by some people, and we maybe needed to go back and revisit some of those issues to do with race. And so I put Tambu in this school where she has to engage with basically a white community. Now, it was also important for me to talk about complicity and how, as highly melanated people, we are often intentionally or maybe not intentionally complicit in our own subjugation. And that was something I was beginning to see happening in Zimbabwe. And so I used the character of Tambudzai to show that. In This Mournable Body, I had just read the essay about It was an essay that contrasted the response to the Charlie Hebdo killings and the massacre at Garissa in Kenya, and how the whole world almost was suddenly Charlie Hebdo, but it was just a few students in Eastern Europe who staged a lie-in to commemorate the Kenyan students who were killed at Garissa. And the essay, I don't remember right now the title of the essay, but it questioned why some bodies are more mournable than others. And I wanted to make the point that we are all mournable. Tamudzai develops into this really unpleasant character, but we should actually mourn people who end up in that situation. And I also wanted to engage with the idea of redemption, and that through mourning we can come to some kind of redemption. And so Tamudzai serves all those purposes for me.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. The lady there.
Hi, Tsitsi. Thank you for the wonderful I think earlier you mentioned that you moved back to Zim in 2020, and I'm curious to know why that timing and what you find the most energizing and enriching about being back home versus staying or sitting here, and how you're reflecting on that choice.
Okay, I was in Germany at the time. I finished my degree in filmmaking and I wasn't having much success in getting my films off the ground in Germany. But that was also the time of the land reform, and there was a lot of reporting on German television, and it was one series of reports in particular that made me think maybe I shouldn't be here. And it was a bit of footage, about maybe 2 minutes of it, which showed a very emaciated man throwing a log into a burning log cabin, obviously one of the structures on a farm. And I saw this, the first time I saw it, they said, oh, violence has broken out in Zimbabwe. And then about 2 weeks later, I saw the same footage on another news report, and the commentary was that violence has escalated in Zimbabwe. And then a few weeks later, I saw the same footage, and it was about violence is getting out of hand in Zimbabwe. And so I wrote to them and I said, how can you use the same footage and have 3 different versions of what is going on? And they actually wrote back to me, and they called me Mr. Dangarembga. They actually wrote back to me and said it was our interpretation. So I thought, well, I'd better get back there and interpret for myself. So that was really a part of the strong motivation. And then I had 2 children at the time, and my daughter was just about to go to school. And I had to make the decision whether I wanted her to be schooled in the German system or the Zimbabwean system. The Zimbabwean system was still good at the time, and I was not in a position in Germany to ensure that she would get the best education. And so that was another factor.
One last question. Lady in the back.
Hello, Tsitsi. I'm a less melanated person from Zimbabwe. I would very diligently be reporting. I'd like to learn about my own country from writers like you. One thing I wasn't sure about is when you said about film and you used validation from whites, why would that be? Surely you don't need our validation. It's your story, and you don't need anybody's validation.
Okay, yeah, as far as the story goes, that's true. But film is capital intensive, and so you need money. And all forms of cultural production, local, indigenous forms of cultural production were discouraged during the colonial era and were not we were not encouraged to go into that kind of production. And if you look at the production houses that existed in Rhodesia, the commercial ones, they were all telling stories about white people, and it was only the bureau, the literature bureau, that told stories about black people and specific ones. And it was the same with film. Film in the British colonies began as propaganda for war efforts and basically to keep people in line. And the colonial film unit was first of all housed in London, and then it went into the ministries of information in the colonies. So you might remember production services in Mazoe Street that was run by the Ministry of Information. And so it was never about allowing people to tell their own stories. So now we do not have a culture of it, we don't have a tradition of it, and Zimbabweans, there are not that many wealthy Zimbabweans who are concerned with the arts, they're concerned with other things. And so they tend not to want to invest heavily in the industry. And so you need to look elsewhere for the money, and whoever has the money will decide which story should be told. And as I said, a lot of the money does come from the development aid framework, which only tells certain kinds of stories. I looked on the German website, Bread for the World, the other day, and they have a film unit that funds African films, but they actually say that they fund African films that explain Africa to Germans.
Thank you for that response. I think it's obvious but important to say that often the gatekeepers and the people in charge of distributing that money are people who don't look like you and I. So it's not a case of necessarily trying to appease the white audience, it's just the fact that they often are the ones holding the purse strings and decide who gets the money for a project or not. I want to thank you so much for this incredible, enriching conversation. This collection brought forth so many emotions in me, complex emotions, but really I was just absolutely blown away by your imagination, but also your fortitude, your sense of self, your belief in yourself to be able to make a way when there is no way. And I think this is it's a landmark collection, and thank you so much for the book and this enriching conversation. If everyone could give Tsitsi a round of applause.